the way that bias shows itself, I'm sure the way my bias shows itself is interesting at times too. But with John Green, what I think is interesting is he kind of does this, here are all the accomplishments, but it was so terrible because all these other bad things happened. Or, here are all these bad things that happened, but it wasn't so bad because look at all these good things that happened. The truth is that the history of all human societies is a mixture of wonderful accomplishments and horrible atrocities. You can find that everywhere. It's in the Muslim world, it's in Africa, it's in Spanish colonial America, it's in pre-Spanish colonial Central and South America, namely the Aztec and Incan empires. It's in China's relationship with Japan and Korea, with Mongolia. It's in Russia's relationship with the Ukraine, and with everywhere around the world. You're going to find a combination of remarkable human accomplishment and horrible human atrocities. The Christian worldview gives us a very good reason to expect that that's going to be the case. All people are made in the image of God, and all people are sinful by nature. And so we all have great potential to accomplish great things, and we all also have a tendency to be sinful, and that sin tends to manifest itself in enslaving others, oppressing others, yes, polluting the environment, exploiting natural resources solely for our own gain and profit without the thought of the consequences. All of these things are a very normal part of all avenues of human history. But John Green shows a lot of his bias in what he chooses to emphasize and chooses to underemphasize. Even going to the ridiculous lengths of doing an open letter to human sacrifice and trying to excuse the Aztec practice of human sacrifice to try to make them look not quite so bad. After all, they had a great advanced city like Venice built on canals. Isn't that great? Generally, John Green's bias is a very typical one among liberals, among socialists, and that is anything that we, that is white Westerners, did, we minimize the achievements and accomplishments and we maximize the atrocities. So that, even when talking about human sacrifice, if it wasn't us, the we, who are doing it, you can sort of downplay that atrocity and, play up the other. But when you're talking about living conditions for slaves and how different they were in America versus Central and South America, rather than saying it was a good thing that slaves lived healthier, longer lives, you only emphasize the bad, which is that they were bred and their children were sold, which was bad, right? But there's an inability to really sort of commend in a sincere way the rightful accomplishments, achievements of us, our people, right? And there is a need to sort of magnify or maximize the accomplishments of the other, of them, whether it's the Muslims or the Africans or the Aztecs or the Chinese, to maximize their achievements and accomplishments and to minimize their atrocities, either by not talking about them at all, like when he talked about Islam in Africa, he skipped over talking about slavery. He mentions it briefly in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, which I'm glad he finally did, but it's in the larger context of this other biased perspective. So the interesting thing about that is that it appears on the surface to be less racist, to be less ethnocentric, because after all, when it comes to us and our people, I mean, John Green's a white guy like I am, right? So when it comes to us and our people, we will downplay their achievements and accomplishments, and we will be outraged, morally indignant at the atrocities. And when it comes to the rest of the world, to the darker skinned people, we will maximize their accomplishments and their achievements, and we will minimize and downplay and gloss over their atrocities. And that can feel like it's less racist than the old-fashioned way of doing history, which is to praise Western civilization and the accomplishments of America and to sort of downplay and badmouth the accomplishments and achievements of the rest of the world. Which honestly, sometimes Rodney Stark is guilty of that. He's guilty of that old school way of approaching things. But I don't think it's actually an improvement at all, because you're still choosing to treat the histories of different civilizations differently based upon the ethnicity or the cultural background of that civilization. So you're still choosing to say, we're going to treat this civilization different from the way we treat this civilization because this civilization has this ethnic characteristic and this civilization doesn't. And it may not even be a conscious choice, right? It's usually a subconscious choice. Subconscious choice A of the sort of traditional old school variety is, me and my people, we are great. We're the best. We're the best it's ever been. So we're going to show you how great we are, right? Subconscious level of school B, the sort of progressive liberal school, is to say, oh, we and our people are terrible. We are the problem in the world. Other people must be better than we are, so we're going to sort of tell that story, which isn't really sincere. It's almost sort of a false self-deprecation. But at the end of the day, you're still choosing to treat different civilizations differently based upon the ethnicity involved. Whether you're overly praising them or overly criticizing them because they're white or non-white, it's still racially based, it's still biased, and it's still something that is, I think, an inappropriate way of approaching history. So that's my soapbox moment. Let's move on with actual class. Okay. So the Atlantic slave trade. First of all, a little flashback. Part of what we talked about last week was the Columbian Exchange, and I found this really cool graphic and I thought I'd share it with you. This is a great pictorial representation of the Columbian Exchange, which we were talking about last week. So the old world introduced to the new world bananas, cattle, chickens, citrus fruits, coffee beans, grapes, horses, onions, peaches, pigs, rice, sugarcane, and wheat. Many of these things we have come to think of as new world things, like where do most of the bananas in the world come from? Central and South America, we think, right? Coffee beans. Think about Central and South American coffee beans, right? Sugar cane. Vast sugar cane plantations in Central and South America, particularly South America. Wheat. Go out to the Midwest, the United States, the Great Plains, and you'll see fields of wheat, miles of wheat, right? So many of these things have come to be thought of. Georgia as the peach state, right? Citrus in Florida. But they came from the old world. And the old world brings back over to the new world brings back over to the old world. I always get those mixed up in my head. I don't know why. It's like a mental block. The new world brings back over to the old world beans, chocolate, corn, peanuts, pineapple, potatoes, pumpkin, squash, sweet potatoes, tobacco, tomatoes, and turkeys. And some of those we have come to really associate with Europe. For example, tomatoes. What would Italian cooking be without tomatoes, right? Or potatoes. What would the history of Ireland be without potatoes, right? All these things. But this is the great agricultural exchange that took place after Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. That's why it's called the Columbian Exchange. Not that Christopher Columbus himself did much trading, but it was sort of made possible by him. That's why it's called the Columbian Exchange. But we're not talking about that level of exchange. We're talking about a much more bloody and sad and tragic exchange, and that is the exchange of silver and sugar and rum and other goods for human lives. How many African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas? Somewhere between 10 and 12 million. Current estimates are around 12.5 million. 12 million is a good number. That's a lot of people. A lot of people brought over on a lot of ships for a lot of years. And we're talking about the years really 1500 to 1800. So about a 300-year period of time. After 1800, the transatlantic slave trade slows down considerably to 1850. 1850 is really when it ends. So 1500 to 1850, about a 350-year period of time. One of the biggest misconceptions of the Atlantic slave trade is that Europeans just obtained African slaves by capturing them, by going over and kidnapping them. Now, they did that, okay? There certainly were European slavers who would go over and would go out and look for someone and kidnap them, throw a net over them, drag them away, and sell them. There were man stealers. They also dealt with African man stealers. But for the most part, it was considered to be trade. And the reason why Europeans could show up on the shores of Africa and engage in trade for slaves is because already in Africa, slaves were held as commodity. These were slaves. They were held as slaves in Africa. So African slave owners sold their slaves to European slave traders, who then took them across the Atlantic Ocean where they worked in European plantations. So it's not like they used to be free and then they were slaves. Most of them were already slaves, held as slaves in Africa, sold as slaves to Europeans. So that's important. So they were human beings, obviously made in the image of God and having infinite worth, but they were also commodities. They were property, and they were viewed that way by both Africans and by Europeans. Now, the slave ship is one of the most deadly, disastrous things that has ever been invented by people. You've got a ship that can hold, reasonably it could hold about 100 people, maybe. And you fill it up with 400 plus slaves, each person getting about 4 square feet of space. So you put in as much space as you can, and you cram in the people as much as you can. And then, of course, they have to go across the Atlantic on a sailboat. So this takes weeks, right? It's not like they were just in this hold for 6 hours or a day or even just 2 or 3 days. It really is horrible living conditions when you think about it in any way, shape, or form. So slavery in the New World was not just one experience, though. It was actually very different depending upon where you were. The worst place to be a slave in the New World was in Brazil. And that's where the largest percentage of slaves went. Almost 1/3, or actually a little bit more than 1/3, of all the slaves who came over from Africa ended up in Brazil. And there they had an average life expectancy on the sugar plantations of 23 years old. So they were brought over by the millions, and they were killed off by the millions. You notice that only a small stream goes to America, the United States of America. Of the 12 million slaves that were brought over, about 500,000 slaves ended up being sold to the United States of America. And yet, by the time of the Civil War, you had a slave population in America of 5 or 6 million slaves. How did we get so many slaves if we didn't import them? Well, it's because in America, slaves were healthier, they lived longer lives, they had children, they became a growing, multiplying population. Now, part of that was just smart economics. American slave owners realized that if they were to take care of their slaves and ensure that they were healthy and ensure that they had offspring, they could pay for 2 slaves, a man and a woman, and they could get children who, when they grew up, could either be slaves for them or could be sold off. And so their initial investment of buying 2 slaves could grow to be 6, 8 slaves that could either become their own slaves, labor, or could be sold off. And they did. I mean, there was not, I don't want to make light of it, like being a slave in America was a dream, because it wasn't. You had no rights, you were a piece of property. Your marriage was not legally recognized, so even if you were married, your husband or your wife could be sold off to another place with or without you. Your children were not legally yours, they were property of the owner, and they could be sold off, and often were, even if, as often happened, the slave master slept with a female slave and had children. Those children, even though they were the biological children of the slave master, were slaves. They were property. Thomas Jefferson did this, we know, with Sally Hemings. So this is the reality of it. But it is also true that if you were a slave in America, you had a normal life expectancy, you could expect to have children and even grandchildren, you were relatively healthy and strong. But if you were a slave in Central and South America, especially in Brazil, you lived a short and brutal life. Here's a 210-year time period from 1650 to 1860. This is when almost all of the slaves that were brought over were brought over. Before 1650, you had a few in the Caribbean, but they didn't really get going until about 1650. And this is where they went, and this is what they did. So you can see, starting in the north, around Richmond, Virginia, right, tobacco. Further down in the south, cotton. Even further in the south, rice, sugar, right? And then as you get into Central America, you start to see more mining, and more mining in South America. And the mining in Central and South America was brutal. It was deadly. The mercury mining in particular, mercury is used to purify silver, and the mining of mercury is a poison. And so the mining of mercury was deforming and debilitating and horrible. So horrible that parents were willing to disfigure and maim their own children to keep them from being used as slaves in the mercury mines. But here's another perspective, okay? In South America, in the Spanish Kingdom of Peru, 1 in 7 adult males had to serve 1 year in the silver mines. And that was terrible, right? But remember when John Green was praising ancient Egypt and how wonderful it was? Well, basically every adult male was expected to work on the pharaoh's pyramids for a certain number of months in between planting and harvest every year. That was a slave labor of massive proportion, and lots of people died doing that. And yet you don't remember John Green going on and on about how horrible Egyptian slave labor was. It was, because people are horrible, as well as wonderful, because we're sinners made in the image of God. All right, so racism and slavery. This video, he does fairly, and I want to give him full credit for this, he does fairly and accurately relate that the beginning of black African slaves being traded outside of Africa to be used in slavery elsewhere, it dates back to the 8th century, that is to the 700s, and to the Muslims who first came into Africa. Where I was in Uganda a couple weeks ago, one of the tribes, the Oringa tribe, which is about 97% Muslim today, that tribe initially converted to Islam because they knew that if they as a tribe converted to Islam, they would not be bought and sold by the Muslim slave traders. So Muslim slave traders penetrated throughout Africa, and a lot of the conversions that John Green talked about, where he said, oh, these people just decided to convert to Islam. Well, a lot of those were motivated by these Muslims. They buy black Africans for the slave market, but they won't buy a fellow Muslim. So if I become a Muslim, then I can be safe from slavery. So they weren't necessarily converted at the point of a sword of saying convert or die, but they knew that if they converted, they wouldn't be sold into slavery. And so that was a pretty powerful incentive for conversion. Okay, so back to our questions. So who began the practice of taking black Africans and enslaving them abroad? It was the Muslims. What else did the Muslims begin? They also began the idea that black Africans were racially inferior and they deserved to be slaves. And John Green traces the history of this idea well too, in that he says it began with the Muslim world, and then the Spanish and Portuguese, because they had the most contact with the Muslim world, they picked up on this racist idea and spread it throughout the rest of Europe. But it's not like the rest of Europe was morally outraged and shocked by this racism. They willingly went along with it because it served their interests, at least for a couple hundred years, until they decided that it really wasn't a good idea. And William Wilberforce and others who were strong Christians led the fight to abolish slavery. All right, what two ideas were vital to the Atlantic slave trade? First is the idea that slavery can be a hereditary status that is passed down through generations. And the second is that slavery is a result of human sin. So the result of human sin is the idea that after the flood, God cursed Ham and his son Canaan. Now, as a biblical scholar, this is just ridiculous nonsense to take this, the curse of Ham, right? So, the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham violates his father in some way. The Bible says he uncovered his, or looked upon his father's nakedness after the flood, right? This happens. And so, but what Noah says to Ham is, cursed be Canaan, who was one of Ham's sons. A servant he will be to his brothers. Now, this was actually used in the Bible as an explanation for why the Canaanites living in the land of Israel, Palestine, Canaan, why the Canaanites were so corrupt and idolatrous and weak. Because they were descendants from Ham through Canaan and had inherited a really bad legacy and a curse. But it applied to the Canaanites, not black Africans. So, justifying this, some Bible scholars said, well, the sons of Ham ended up in Africa and they're black, and the reason why they're black is because they bear the mark of Ham, and the mark of Ham is dark skin, and that's the curse, and that means you're going to be a servant to others. That's nowhere in the Bible. That is absolutely nowhere in the Bible. It's ridiculous nonsense. But it was believed, even by American evangelical Protestant Christians, even up until the 1960s and 70s. It was believed that black people had dark skin because they were cursed with the mark of Ham, and thus they were supposed to be slaves. It's evil, it's unbiblical, it's nonsensical, but it was a deadly idea that lasted for hundreds of years. All right, let's talk about the Aztecs for a minute. The Aztecs, John Green does a better job than many in giving a balanced perspective on the Aztecs. Most of the time, what you hear is the Aztecs were this wonderful, advanced civilization that was brutally conquered by the Spanish for no reason other than the Spanish wanted their gold, which is an oversimplified and unfair way of telling the story. So John Green does talk about the fact that the Aztecs were themselves a brutal empire that ruled over thousands of people who were not their natural kin. They were imperialists of Central America. And also that they practiced human sacrifice and intimidation through human sacrifice. So not only was this done to sort of appease the gods and prevent the apocalypse, but it was also done to intimidate and subjugate their conquered peoples, which is why when the Spanish come over, when Cortez comes over, he finds very many willing natives who want to help him overthrow the Aztecs, because the Aztecs were not well liked because they were a harsh imperialist people. The Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan, which is where Mexico City is today, was built entirely on water, serviced by canals, and crops were grown in floating gardens. A pretty awesome engineering accomplishment for sure. All right, Spanish silver. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, that's between the 1500s and the 1700s, the Spanish in Central and South America mined 150,000 tons of silver. 150,000 tons, each ton being 2,000 pounds, of silver. That's a lot. That's millions and millions of pounds of silver. This was 80% of the world's supply of silver. And so the Spanish peso, the Spanish coin, became the currency for the world because it was pure silver coin. This made Spain very wealthy, although in sort of a short-term, unsustainable way. John Green blames the poor tax structure. The reality is, whenever you are not manufacturing and producing your own goods and wealth on the basis of your own work, but you're just exploiting it from others, you're riding on a bubble that's going to burst. Okay, so single commodity economies, whether that's cotton in the South or oil in the Middle East now, or silver in the Spanish Empire, but especially single commodity economies that rely on exploitation of others, are very unstable and very unsustainable. But the Spanish were wealthy for long enough to build a very impressive fleet, known in history as the Spanish Armada, and to invade England in 1588. This is an important date that we're going to add to our list of important dates at the end of class. The Spanish Armada. Now here's a myth about the Spanish Armada. Everybody thinks the Spanish had way more ships than the English. They did not. They had fewer ships than the English, but they had more guns. So how do you measure the impressiveness of a navy? Is it in number of ships alone? Well, in numbers of ships, the English had more ships than the Spanish. But the Spanish had more guns. But the English had better guns. And the Spanish ships were bigger, but the English ships were faster and more maneuverable. So, what's the important thing here about the Spanish Armada is that the Spanish did have the English outgunned, but the English won a decisive victory, and Elizabeth I got much of the credit for it. Now, John Green repeats something that's become very popular in modern historian circles, and that is that really the Spanish Armada was just defeated by bad weather. It was just bad luck. The English weren't really that great. Well, there was bad weather, and bad weather certainly played a role, but England did have smaller, faster ships. They had better maneuverability, and while they had fewer cannons, their cannons were better. The quality of the metal of their cast cannons was better, and so their cannons were less likely to explode. Spanish cannons exploded with alarming frequency, and their ships were not as maneuverable. Also, the English admirals had better tactics and strategy than the Spanish admirals, including the use of fire ships to create panic. So, 1588, the Spanish Armada comes up and comes across the English Channel, and there's a series of battles. Many of the early battles are won by the Spanish, but the English are able to keep the Spanish Armada from landing along that southern coast. And so they're able to keep the Spanish Armada moving in a west to east fashion and successfully keeps them from landing at any one of those southern ports where they would have had easy access to London. And England had almost no standing army at this time, by the way. Their entire national defense was naval. So if the Spanish had been able to land their invasion force, they had about 11,000 men on board the ships who were soldiers, who were the army, the invading army. If they had been able to put them on land, the Spanish would have conquered England. But England was able to prevent them from landing through a series of naval engagements, the last of which took place at Gravelines. And if you look at where Gravelines is on the screen there next to the flag, so the Dutch are helping the English are helping the Dutch. It's really an alliance, right? Gravelines right there is where the Spanish Armada could have turned and gone up the Thames to get to London. But at that battle, the English and Dutch, almost in desperation, decided to use fire ships. 8 different times they took their own ships, usually ones that were pretty badly damaged, set them on fire, and directed them toward the Spanish Armada. So if you're in a giant wooden ship filled with gunpowder, and you see a ship on fire coming at you, you're going to panic, and you're going to try to flee. And that's exactly what happens. So the use of fire ships at Gravelines was really the decisive victory for the English. During the Spanish Armada, the Spanish lost 35 of their ships at Gravelines, actually. They lost 35 of their ships. Total, they had like 135 ships, and they went home with about 70 of them, so they lost about half their ships. But about almost 40-ish of those were lost in shipwrecks due to storms. The Spanish lost 35,000 men. Only about 10,000 made it home. Just think, 3/4 of this large force was killed. The English and Dutch, by contrast, only lost between 50 and 100 men in battle. Another 6,000 to 8,000 died from disease. And to be fair, many of the Spanish, probably, well, at least 5,000, maybe more of the Spanish died in shipwrecks and not directly in battle. So after the defeat at Gravelines, if you look at this map carefully, you can see what the Spanish Armada decided to do. They sailed around to the north, and they went over to Ireland. Part of why they did this is because Ireland was Catholic, and so they were trying to provoke the Irish into a rebellion against the English. So plan A for the Spanish was to try to land along the southern coast of England. Plan B was to try to go up the Thames to London. And then plan C became, okay, let's land in Ireland, and we'll take our 10,000 guys and lead an Irish uprising, and then from Ireland we can have a base of operations to go across and invade England. Well, that was the worst of all of them, and this is where all the storms come in. There's bad weather, which, by the way, was being caused by the mini ice age. Remember that? Terrible North Atlantic storms swept across and battered and bashed all of these Spanish ships. They lost ship after ship after ship after ship because that coast of Ireland is very rocky and there's lots of islands, and it's not a good place to try to bring a wooden sailboat in a storm. So they lost a lot of those men. But there were lots of lasting effects from the Armada. So Spain was defeated, so the immediate tactical reality was that Spain was trying to keep the Netherlands under their control. England had come to the help of the Netherlands. Spain was hoping to go up and crush England, thereby reasserting its control over the Netherlands. This doesn't work. Spain loses. The Netherlands will gain independence, and the Netherlands will become an important place because about 30 years, 20 years later, some English Puritans will go across to the Netherlands seeking religious freedom, and then from the Netherlands, 10 years or later, they're going to sail across to America in 1520 on a boat called the Mayflower. So the Spanish Armada leads to, 30 years later, the Pilgrims coming to America, because of the whole Netherlands connection here. It also leads to several other things. Elizabeth becomes a very popular, well-loved queen. She gives a very stirring speech to the Navy after the Battle of Gravelines, and so she comes in and rallies the troops after this great victory. She is seen as being very wise and very cunning, and so she continues to reign for about 20 years after this, and it becomes one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. And then also there's a rise in national English pride, which is going to help a guy named William Shakespeare, who launches his playwright career early on by writing historical plays celebrating the accomplishments of the past kings of England. So that's what the early Shakespeare plays are. They're kind of national hero plays, although not all the kings are all that great. But Henry V, which is probably the best of the set, is definitely a great hero tale. So it has all sorts of lasting implications. The British Navy is strengthened. It continues to be one of the premier navies and then becomes the premier navy in the world. Part of the effect of that is that, trips to the New World are increased after 1588, and so you have the establishment of Jamestown in 1607, Massachusetts Bay in 1620, Plymouth Colony in 1620, Massachusetts Bay in 1629. So all happening after the Spanish Armada. If England had been defeated and had been Spanish, we'd all be Catholic today. That's kind of part of the bottom line of that. All right, moving on to wrap up. We're going to add the defeat of the Spanish Armada, 1588, to our list of important dates. It is important because it really solidifies English independence, English Protestantism, and becomes an important precursor to the founding of the English colonies in America. And it's kind of in many ways you can trace it as the origin of America's birth, is in the defeat of the Spanish Armada. All right, that's all I have for you today, and I will see you guys on Thursday in class as we continue learning together. So, see you then.